I never imagined my life could unravel so completely in a single evening. I walked into my own kitchen to find Evan sitting there, not alone, but with a woman I didn't know, the kind of woman whose presence immediately made me aware that my marriage had been breached in ways I hadn't allowed myself to fully comprehend. Her hand rested casually on his arm, and Evan smiled at her the way a man smiles when he thinks he's won something, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to descend. I froze. My heart pounded in a rhythm I didn't recognize. This was supposed to be our home, our safe space. Instead, it felt like a stage for betrayal. "We need to talk," he said, his voice calm, as if the last 5 years could be dismissed with 3 words. I could hardly breathe. In that instant, every little detail I had ignored, the late dinners with mysterious excuses, the secretive phone calls, the sudden enthusiasm for a wine club that kept her occupied 3 nights a week, flashed through my mind. My chest tightened as I realized Evan had been leading a double life, and I had been blind to it. It was shocking, humiliating, infuriating, but strangely empowering. I didn't shout, I didn't cry. I simply observed, taking in every detail: the smug look on his face, the oblivious comfort of the woman beside him, the very air of entitlement he carried. I knew then that this wasn't just a betrayal of my trust. It was a threat to my life, my home, my financial security. And as I stood there, letting the reality settle in, I made a silent vow: I would not let him destroy me. That night, I began to plot a path forward, not one of impulsive rage, but of strategy, calm, and precision. I would reclaim what was mine, protect my dignity, and survive. And in that moment, I realized something deeper. Sometimes, surviving betrayal requires more courage than any fight could demand. I'm 31, running a home renovation business here in Colorado, a job that keeps me busy, grounded, and deeply invested in my own capabilities. I met Evan when I was 26. He was charming, thoughtful, and intelligent, the kind of man who made you feel like you could trust him with everything. Back then, I was ambitious, but cautious, still healing from a past relationship that had left me wary of total surrender. But Evan had a way of easing that fear, of making the world feel like it was ours to navigate together. For 5 years, we built a life together, or so I believed. Our mornings were usually quiet. I'd sip coffee while planning projects, and he'd scroll through emails before heading to work. We shared meals, laughter, and dreams. I thought I understood him completely. Evan had a daughter from a previous marriage, Emily, who is 24 now. She's bright, competent, and deeply involved in my business accounting. I loved her like my own, and I thought he appreciated the way I integrated myself into his family life. Yet, even in those early years, subtle signs went unnoticed. The secretive texts he would dismiss too quickly, the sudden enthusiasm for networking events that conveniently took him out of the house, and the way he sometimes seemed distracted, lost in thought in a way that I couldn't place. His family was equally influential. They were charming but insistent, often pushing me to make decisions that benefited them, while criticizing my choices in subtle, veiled ways. I tried to navigate it with grace, believing that compromise was part of love. I trusted that Evan, my partner, would protect our relationship from their interference. Evan and I shared dreams of a life filled with stability and creativity. I loved remodeling houses, creating spaces where people felt at home. He was supportive, or at least he appeared to be. We even discussed children, vacations, and long-term plans. Those discussions now felt surreal, tainted by the knowledge that he had already begun living a life separate from mine, one that included someone else. Looking back, I realized there were moments I could have questioned, slightly extended absences, the glances at his phone that seemed too quick to be innocent, but I dismissed them. Love, I thought, required trust. I believed in Evan, and I believed we were building something lasting. But sometimes the most carefully constructed trust can hide the deepest betrayals. As I remember our life together, the laughter, the shared projects, the quiet nights, I feel a strange mixture of nostalgia and resolve. I grieve the illusion, the version of Evan I thought I knew, even as I began to prepare myself for the confrontation that would define the next chapter of my life. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. Evan's behavior began to shift in ways that at first seemed innocuous: extra meetings that he claimed were work-related, evenings spent out without explanation, and an uncharacteristic focus on appearances. He would dress more sharply for grocery runs or casual dinners, always with his phone face down on the table, texting or checking messages while I felt the weight of his distraction. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps he was stressed. Maybe there were work pressures I didn't understand. But something in my gut whispered otherwise. That subtle sense of unease became a constant companion. I noticed the small details, a faint scent of perfume that wasn't mine, the way he smiled at someone on the phone before quickly shutting it off, the way his stories about late meetings never quite added up. Friends and family began to notice too. Brent, my best friend, once mentioned casually, "Have you noticed Evan seems off lately?" I shrugged it off, insisting I was imagining things, but those comments planted seeds of doubt I couldn't ignore. Even his parents, while outwardly supportive, would make remarks that seemed harmless at the time but carried an undertone of judgment or manipulation, subtly pressuring me to conform to their expectations. The tension in the house grew, invisible yet palpable. Conversations that had once flowed easily became stilted and cautious. I caught myself rehearsing questions, thinking carefully before speaking, measuring my tone, afraid of triggering defensiveness or evasion. Evan would brush off concerns with charm or humor, but it no longer masked the growing distance between us. Then came the evenings he spent at the wine club. What started as networking for his professional connections soon became suspiciously frequent, accompanied by secrecy and sudden changes in schedule. I noticed him returning home late, with clothes that smelled faintly of something floral, a subtle reminder that something was amiss. Each small anomaly was a thread in a tapestry I didn't yet fully understand. I began to recall instances from the past months, the hurried exits, the unexplained texts, the little inconsistencies in his stories. They no longer seemed trivial. They were signs, clues pointing toward a hidden reality. And then the photograph arrived. Brent had texted me late one night. Evan, sitting too close to a woman I didn't know, her hand resting casually on his arm at some upscale bar. My stomach dropped. Seeing the evidence crystallized the unease I had felt for months. The doubt, the whispers, the small inconsistencies, they were all real. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of betrayal. It wasn't just suspicion anymore, it was confirmed. Evan had begun a life outside of our marriage, a secret affair with another woman, while pretending everything was normal. The house, our plans, our shared life, it was all under threat. And yet, amid the shock and hurt, a spark of resolve ignited. I realized I needed to act, not with rash emotion, but with strategy, precision, and clarity. The next steps I took would determine not just the outcome of this betrayal, but the preservation of my dignity, my assets, and my future. The night it all became undeniable is etched in my memory with painful clarity. I had returned from a client meeting, tired but expecting the comfort of home, of routine. Instead, the atmosphere was charged with a tension I couldn't immediately place. There he was, Evan, sitting at our kitchen table, casually leaning toward a woman whose presence felt like an invasion. She smiled too easily, her hand resting on his arm, as if this space had always belonged to her. I stopped mid-step, my heart hammering in my chest. I could feel my pulse in my temples, a rapid thrum that matched the cold dread creeping through my spine. My hands trembled, not with weakness, but with the sudden awareness of everything I had ignored, every warning sign, every subtle lie. "We need to talk," Evan said, his tone calm, as if saying these words absolved him of months of deception. The casual normalcy of his voice made the scene feel surreal, like watching a disturbing play unfold in slow motion. I took a measured step forward. "Talk? About what, Evan?" My voice was calm, deliberately calm, but underneath, it trembled with barely contained fury. I had rehearsed this confrontation in my mind countless times, but nothing could have prepared me for the physical impact of seeing him here, in my kitchen, betraying me. He didn't meet my gaze. Instead, he glanced at the woman beside him, a subtle, possessive flicker in his expression that made my stomach churn. "You know what this is about. I'm keeping my life organized, and we need to settle things." The words hung in the air, grotesque in their casual cruelty. He was framing this betrayal as some sort of administrative necessity, a logical action devoid of moral consequence. I felt bile rise in my throat, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but a voice in my mind urged patience, strategy, control. I couldn't let anger dictate my actions. Not yet. I surveyed the scene, the smug satisfaction on the woman's face, Evan's complacent ease, the familiarity with each other that had never been afforded to me, and suddenly the accumulated weight of months of subtle betrayal hit me. The late dinners, the unexplained absences, the phone that never rested in his pocket, the perfume, the secrecy. Every tiny clue now became a clear signal. "You've been seeing her," I said, my words deliberate, controlled, slicing through the room like a knife. My lips were tight, my jaw clenched, but my voice didn't waver. I needed him to hear it, to acknowledge the undeniable. Evan looked at me, eyes flickering briefly with irritation, then feigned casual surprise. "I don't know what you mean." I stepped closer, keeping my gaze locked on his. "Don't lie to me. I've seen enough. I've known for months. Don't bother pretending you didn't think I'd notice." He laughed softly, dismissively, a sound that should have broken me, but instead fueled a quiet fury. "I didn't think you'd make a big deal out of it. It's just—" He hesitated, searching for words that didn't exist. "Life." I felt the room spin slightly, a nauseating mix of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. My hands were trembling now, not from fear, but from the intensity of my emotions. My chest tightened, my heart racing, yet beneath it all was a cold, crystallized resolve. I realized, with shocking clarity, that my life, my assets, my dignity were mine to protect. Evan's actions, his casual betrayal, could not touch that. I walked out of the kitchen for a moment, letting the air of the night soothe my shock. The coolness against my skin reminded me that I was alive, capable, and not powerless. I could feel my pulse slowing, my mind sharpening. Every instinct told me, act strategically, not emotionally. Returning to the table, I met Evan's gaze directly. "I'm not going to beg, I'm not going to plead, but I need you to understand something. Nothing you've done can take from me what is rightfully mine. You can try, but I will be ready." The woman's smile faltered slightly, and Evan's smirk lost a hint of confidence. For the first time, they realized that I was no longer the naive, trusting partner they had underestimated. I had seen the betrayal, acknowledged it fully, and I was already planning my defense, not just for my assets, but for my life, my dignity, and my future. That night, I didn't sleep. I pored over every document I had, every financial record, every legal paper, preparing myself for the inevitable confrontation that would determine not just the future of my marriage, but the control of my own life. The inciting incident was clear. Betrayal had been confirmed, and the real fight had only just begun. The hours after that night were some of the longest I've ever experienced. I sat on the edge of our living room couch, staring at the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds, my mind replaying every detail of what I had seen. My chest felt heavy, as though the weight of betrayal pressed against it, constricting my lungs. My hands shook slightly, not from weakness, but from adrenaline and anger intertwining with grief. I tried to make sense of it all. How had I missed the signs? The late dinners, the perfume, the secrecy, they had all pointed here, but I had wanted to believe in us, in him. In the calm logic of my mind, I began retracing the last 6 months. Every anomaly became evidence. Every inconsistency, a thread that tied Evan to a life I hadn't been invited into. The realization that he had been living this double life was a punch to the gut, but also a spark for clarity. I called my mother first. Diane has always been sharp, decisive, and merciless when it comes to matters of fairness and justice. Her voice, calm yet commanding, grounded me in the storm. "If you think he's planning something, you better plan faster," she said. Those words echoed in my head for hours. I knew she was right. My next moves had to be calculated, precise, and legal. No emotion could cloud my judgment. Then I reached out to my attorney, Harper Lee, someone who had handled family and business matters with brutal efficiency for years. Harper is direct, pragmatic, and unafraid of confrontation, a perfect ally in a time when my life felt threatened. I recounted the evening's events, the affair, the sense of impending financial danger. Harper listened, nodding, asking pointed questions that forced me to articulate everything with precision. By the end of the call, I had a plan forming, one that would protect my assets, my business, and my dignity. Yet, beneath the strategic thinking, there was grief. I mourned the version of Evan I thought I knew, the partner who had shared my mornings, my dreams, my life. That person, it seemed, had never existed. I felt an ache for what we could have had, for the future we had imagined together. But the grief was tempered by resolve. I refused to allow myself to be a victim. The first confrontation with Evan after the discovery was deliberate. I approached calmly, maintaining a veneer of composure, but my eyes betrayed the storm inside. "We need to discuss the future," I said, my voice even but firm. "I'm aware of your actions, Evan. I need clarity now." Evan tried to dismiss it with a casual smirk, as if denying reality could erase the evidence I had in my mind. But I stood my ground, detailing the inconsistencies I had observed, the late nights, the wine club, the subtle but unmistakable signs. I watched his reaction carefully, the slight twitch of his jaw, the flicker of unease in his eyes, the tension creeping into his posture. For the first time, he realized that I had not been blind, that I was not naive, and that I was ready to act. I felt a strange mix of power and vulnerability. Power because I was taking control of a situation that threatened to unravel my life. Vulnerability because I was exposing my pain, my trust, my heart. And in that vulnerability, there was clarity. I could no longer pretend ignorance. I had to face the reality of Evan's betrayal head on. Late that night, after he left the room, I sat in silence, reflecting on the confrontation. My pulse gradually slowed, my mind sharpened, and the path forward became clear. Protecting myself legally and emotionally was no longer optional, it was essential. I began organizing my thoughts, gathering documents, preparing for the inevitable legal and emotional battles. By the end of the night, a resolve had taken root. I would not be broken by betrayal. I would not allow Evan's choices to dictate my life. I would fight, not with impulsive rage, but with clarity, strategy, and self-respect. And in that quiet determination, I felt the first stirrings of empowerment, a recognition that even in the wake of deep betrayal, I still had control over my destiny. The days that followed were a tense, calculated dance. Evan seemed almost casual, continuing his routine as if nothing had changed, but I knew better. Every glance, every half-smile, every subtle adjustment in his behavior was loaded with the knowledge that I had discovered his betrayal. He underestimated me entirely. Family involvement escalated things further. Evan's parents, once merely subtly critical, began inserting themselves directly into our conflicts. Phone calls became interrogations. Casual visits turned into sessions of guilt-tripping veiled as concern. "You know Evan has needs," his mother would say, her tone saccharine, eyes sharp. "You should consider how your actions affect him." Their interference felt like manipulation, designed to destabilize me, to make me question my resolve. But I refused to give them that power. Meanwhile, Evan's affair partner, the other woman, was becoming more visible. Social media posts, subtle mutual acknowledgments, even glimpses of lunches together, all pointed to the widening breach in our marriage. Each piece of evidence added weight to the undeniable truth. My husband was actively building a life with someone else, right under my nose. I began gathering proof meticulously. I documented dates, bank statements, social media interactions, and photographs. Each detail, each time-stamped record, was a brick in the wall I was constructing between myself and potential financial and emotional loss. I wasn't acting out of malice. I was protecting myself. The more evidence I collected, the calmer I felt. Clarity came with preparation. Tensions between Evan and me escalated into heated arguments. The air in the house grew thick with unspoken resentments, sharp words, and suppressed emotions. One night I confronted him directly. "Do you even understand what you're doing to us? To me?" My voice shook slightly, but I kept it steady, refusing to allow anger to dictate my words. Evan leaned back, a smug expression on his face. "I'm just being honest with myself," he said, dismissing my concern. "You've been too controlling, too rigid. Maybe this is what I need." The audacity of it made my blood boil. I could feel my heartbeat in my temples, hands tightening into fists. But instead of shouting, I breathed deeply, channeling my fury into focus. I calmly listed every instance of his deception, every lie, every hidden activity. His smirk faltered as I spoke, as the reality of his exposure pressed against the shield he had so carefully built. Friends and colleagues began noticing the strain too. Some tried to mediate, offering advice or subtle warnings, but many simply stepped back, sensing the inevitability of conflict. It was isolating at times, but also clarifying. I realized that true strength often comes from self-reliance, from trusting one's own judgment when others fail to intervene effectively. At the same time, I noticed a subtle shift within myself. The betrayal, the constant tension, and the necessity for strategic thinking began to change me. Not in ways that made me bitter, but in ways that made me more assertive, more analytical, more resilient. I no longer relied solely on emotion to guide me. I learned to combine intellect, observation, and emotional awareness. The financial stakes were rising as well. Evan had begun hinting at leveraging shared assets, attempting to manipulate the narrative to gain advantage. But I was ready. Each transaction, each property deed, every account balance was documented, legally sound, and untouchable. I had learned the hard lesson that trust without verification can be devastating, and I refused to allow his actions to jeopardize my life. By the third week, Evan's demeanor had shifted subtly. He began questioning my movements, noticing that I was more deliberate in my planning, more assertive in my responses. He was trying to regain control, but the tide had turned. The woman who had once seemed untouchable, his affair partner, now became a symbol of his overreach, a reminder that his choices were visible, traceable, and accountable. One evening, the tension reached a breaking point. We faced each other across the kitchen table, the silence charged with months of unspoken resentment. "You think you can manipulate me with your charm," I said, keeping my voice calm but laced with steel. "But I see it all, and I will not allow you to take what is mine, my home, my business, my dignity. Not now, not ever." Evan's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "You think you're clever," he said, "but this isn't over." I smiled faintly, a controlled, almost imperceptible gesture. "It's already over, for me. I've seen the truth, and I'm done being blind." In that moment, I felt a shift within myself. I was no longer the woman who had trusted blindly, who had allowed small inconsistencies to be dismissed. I was a woman who understood her worth, her strength, and her capacity for strategic action. The escalation wasn't just external. It had transformed me internally, forging a resolve that no betrayal could weaken. By the end of that week, Evan and I were in a tense standoff. He, trying to manipulate and control, and I, calmly observing, documenting, and preparing for the inevitable legal and emotional confrontation that would secure my future. The game had changed, and I was no longer playing by his rules. The house felt colder than ever that week. Every room, every corner, echoed with the absence of trust and the presence of betrayal. I walked past the spaces we had once shared with laughter and conversation, and all I could feel was emptiness. Even Brutus, my faithful dog, seemed to sense the tension, following me silently, his usual enthusiasm dampened. The betrayal weighed on me like a stone in my chest. I tried to distract myself with work, emails, projects, remodeling tasks, but even the familiar rhythm of saws and hammers couldn't mask the gnawing ache of being deceived by someone I had loved and trusted. Nights were the worst. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the image of Evan and her at the kitchen table, his casual betrayal cutting deeper than any words could. Doubt began to creep in, uninvited. Had I ignored signs? Could I have done something differently? The questions were relentless, gnawing at my confidence, turning every memory into a potential mistake. I felt isolated, as if everyone in the world understood the situation except me. Even my friends' reassurances felt hollow. Who could truly grasp the intimacy of a marriage unraveling in secret? One evening, after another tense encounter, I found myself alone in the study, staring at the documents I had meticulously organized. Bank statements, deeds, legal paperwork, they were all there, evidence of preparation, yet they couldn't shield me from the emotional devastation. Tears slid down my cheeks, hot and unrelenting. I had always believed that knowledge and strategy could protect me, but now I realized that emotional survival required something more, something I hadn't yet mastered. Memories of our early days together tormented me. The quiet mornings sipping coffee, the shared dreams, the laughter over trivial things, all now poisoned by the reality of Evan's duplicity. I remembered thinking he was my partner, my confidant, my equal. That illusion had shattered, leaving only raw pain and a profound sense of loss. I felt betrayed not only by Evan, but by the very foundation of what I believed love to be. The weight of disillusionment was suffocating. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to feel truly alone. Not in the physical sense, but in the existential one. I had been sharing my life with someone who had been living a parallel existence, one in which my trust, my love, my loyalty meant nothing. Brutus nudged my hand gently, sensing my despair. His presence was a small comfort, a reminder that not everything was lost. Yet even as I petted him, I could feel the darkness pressing in, whispering that I might never recover from this breach of trust. Sleep became elusive. Anxiety filled the spaces between waking and dreaming. I found myself questioning my judgment, my intuition, even my sense of self. The moment of hitting rock bottom came when Evan casually suggested that we resolve things over dinner, as if months of secrecy and betrayal could be erased with a polite conversation. I looked at him, really looked, and saw the arrogance, the complete lack of remorse. The realization that he had no intention of understanding or repairing what he had broken pushed me to the edge. Sitting there, I felt a surge of helplessness. The woman I had trusted, the life I had built, and the stability I had nurtured, all threatened by choices beyond my control. I thought of Emily, my daughter, and worried about the precedent this behavior set for integrity and trust in relationships. I felt crushed, as if the world had tilted, leaving me teetering on the edge of despair. And yet, in that darkness, a small ember flickered. Amid the grief, the betrayal, and the suffocating loneliness, I realized that hitting rock bottom was also a form of clarity. I saw with painful honesty that my next steps had to come from strength, not emotion. I could either let this devastation define me or use it as the foundation to reclaim control over my life. I spent that night writing, organizing my thoughts, documenting my pain. Each word on the page was a tiny act of resistance, a refusal to be consumed by despair. I knew that tomorrow, or the next day, I would have to face Evan again, perhaps legally, perhaps emotionally. But for the first time, I recognized that survival was possible, and that even in this abyss, the seeds of empowerment could take root. The turning point didn't arrive with fanfare. It came quietly, in the middle of sifting through months of documentation, texts, and emails. I realized that everything I needed to protect myself was already in my hands. Every transaction, every bank statement, every legally notarized contract. The weight of uncertainty that had pressed down on me for weeks began to lift slightly, replaced by a clear, focused determination. I remembered my mother's words again. Plan faster. They resonated now more than ever. I wasn't reacting out of anger or revenge. I was planning strategically, deliberately, and decisively. For the first time since discovering Evan's affair, I felt the clarity of control. Every step I took could be measured, deliberate, and unassailable. Then came a conversation with a mutual family friend, someone I trusted implicitly, who had observed Evan's behavior over the past months. She confirmed suspicions I had only dared to hope were true. Evan's affair was more serious and systematic than I had imagined. His attempts to manipulate our shared finances, to isolate me emotionally, to undermine my confidence, all of it was calculated. Hearing this out loud, from a neutral perspective, crystallized the reality I had been piecing together. I realized that this wasn't just about betrayal, it was about self-preservation. I had allowed myself to be vulnerable because I trusted a man I believed loved me. That trust had been exploited, but now, armed with evidence, strategy, and resolve, I had the opportunity to reclaim my life fully. The first actionable step came with setting boundaries. I refused to engage with Evan in casual or emotionally charged conversations. Every communication became deliberate, measured, and intentional. I documented interactions, saved messages, and prepared for the legal confrontation that would ultimately define the outcome of our divorce. Simultaneously, I began reclaiming my emotional strength. I allowed myself to grieve fully for what had been lost. The idealized version of our marriage, the trust, the shared dreams, but I refused to let that grief paralyze me. I reminded myself of my worth, my accomplishments, my independence, and my ability to survive and thrive without Evan. The most pivotal moment came when I reviewed the timeline of asset transfers: the house, the car, the business accounts, all meticulously documented and legally sound. I realized that I was no longer at his mercy. The betrayal that had once left me feeling powerless now became a catalyst for empowerment. I was not just surviving, I was preparing to emerge stronger, more resilient, and fully in control of my life. I made a conscious decision. I would not fight Evan out of vengeance. I would fight to protect myself and assert the life I deserved. That distinction mattered. Revenge is reactive, protection is proactive. My actions from that moment on were deliberate, precise, and focused entirely on safeguarding my future. That night, I sat in the quiet of my home, Brutus curled at my feet, and I felt a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in weeks. The darkness of betrayal was still there, lingering in the edges of my mind, but it no longer dictated my actions. I had found my anchor in strategy, evidence, and the unwavering recognition of my self-worth. For the first time in months, I slept through the night, not because the betrayal was resolved, it wasn't, but because I had reclaimed control. I knew exactly what I had to do, and I trusted myself to follow through. Evan could continue his schemes, continue his attempts at manipulation, but I would not falter. I had become a woman capable of protecting herself, of asserting her value, and of navigating the storm with grace and precision. The turning point wasn't marked by confrontation or dramatic declarations. It was internal, quiet, and powerful. I had crossed from despair to determination, from victimhood to agency. And in that clarity, I saw the path forward: measured legal action, strategic planning, and the unwavering assertion of my worth and independence. I was ready for the final steps, the resolution that would define not just the end of this chapter, but the beginning of a new, empowered life. The days after the turning point felt surreal. Everything I had meticulously prepared, the documentation, the legal consultations, the clear records of financial transactions, began to show their full power. Evan's confidence, once so unshakable, started to falter. The arrogance that had allowed him to manipulate and deceive crumbled under the weight of truth. His parents, who had once subtly pressured me to consider Evan's needs, now became uneasy observers. The impartiality I maintained, combined with the rock-solid evidence I had compiled, made it impossible for them to continue their interference without exposing their own partiality. Slowly they began to withdraw. Calls became less frequent, visits more hesitant. The subtle power they had tried to wield over me slipped from their grasp. Evan's attempts to publicly manipulate the narrative also began to backfire. Friends and acquaintances, initially sympathetic to his frustrations, started noticing inconsistencies in his stories. He had counted on the illusion of control, but the facts, dates, receipts, notarized deeds, and bank transfers were undeniable. Every assertion he made in private or public circles could be countered with documented truth. The facade he had built began to collapse. The affair, once a source of perceived power for him, turned into a liability. Those who knew about it began to distance themselves quietly. His affair partner, now increasingly scrutinized, became a symbol of his recklessness and poor judgment. Rumors, once useful to him, started circulating in ways he hadn't anticipated. Evan found himself isolated, facing the consequences of choices he had assumed would remain hidden. I, on the other hand, maintained calm and composure. Every interaction with Evan was measured. I didn't lash out. I didn't seek revenge. I simply asserted my boundaries, stayed consistent, and let the evidence speak for itself. The contrast between my stability and his unraveling was stark. Friends, colleagues, and even neutral observers could see who had acted with integrity and who had been deceitful. The legal process moved forward, and the outcomes were in line with the preparation I had painstakingly executed. The house and car, legally transferred to my mother before any claim could be made, remained untouchable. My business, separate property, was fully protected. The joint accounts were divided fairly, but nothing was taken from me that I had not willingly agreed to share. Even spousal support was reduced to a fraction of what Evan had hoped to leverage. What struck me most was the psychological fallout. Evan, once so assured, became visibly tense in every encounter. The same man who had tried to undermine me was now cautious, calculating, and often defensive. I watched him falter, not out of cruelty, but as a natural consequence of his actions, meeting the undeniable reality of accountability. The neighborhood, previously oblivious to our private conflicts, became aware of the situation as boundaries and legal actions were enforced. Evan's attempts to assert dominance were met with documentation and calm explanation. Neighbors, initially curious, began to respect the clarity and fairness with which I conducted myself. The sense of order and integrity I maintained contrasted sharply with his frantic, increasingly desperate efforts to control the narrative. Brutus, sensing the shift, regained his playful energy. My daughter, Emily, became a pillar of support, validating my actions and offering encouragement. Our bond strengthened as we navigated the fallout together. I realized that my family, the ones who truly mattered, were steadfast, while Evan's network of perceived allies had proven fragile and unreliable. Through it all, I remained mindful of my own emotional health. I sought therapy, journaled relentlessly, and allowed myself moments of reflection and self-compassion. The goal was not vengeance, but restoration, restoring my sense of security, my dignity, and my agency. Each small victory, the dismissal of frivolous legal claims, the preservation of assets, the affirmation of my rights, was a step toward reclaiming the life that had been threatened. By the time the divorce proceedings concluded, Evan was a shadow of the confident, manipulative man he had once been. His social circle had dwindled, his professional credibility tarnished, and the reality of his choices had isolated him from those he had assumed would remain loyal. I, on the other hand, emerged intact, composed, and increasingly empowered. Leaving the house that had been my battlefield, I felt an unexpected serenity. There was no gloating, no dramatic exit, just a quiet acknowledgement that the chapter had ended and that I had preserved not only my assets, but my integrity. I had survived the storm, and in doing so, I had discovered the true extent of my resilience. The fallout was complete, but it did not define me. Instead, it underscored a truth I had known deep in my heart. Integrity, preparation, and emotional clarity are forces that no betrayal can diminish. Evan's downfall was a natural consequence of his own actions, and witnessing it unfold without interference became a profound affirmation of my strength. The divorce was finally finalized, and the weight I had carried for months began to lift. Walking through the front door of my home, the home I had painstakingly reclaimed, I felt a sense of ownership and freedom that went beyond property or assets. This house, now fully mine, symbolized more than financial stability. It represented resilience, clarity, and the life I had fought to protect. In the quiet mornings, I would make coffee and sit by the window, watching Brutus stretch in the sun and feeling the steady rhythm of my own breath. The chaos of betrayal, the emotional upheaval, the relentless plotting and manipulation, it was all behind me. I had survived without sacrificing my dignity or values, and in that survival, I discovered a truth that no legal victory could fully capture: the power of self-respect and inner strength. Emily came over that evening with a pizza and a movie. We laughed, we reminisced, and for the first time in months, I felt normal. The life we had built together, our bond, our shared responsibilities, our laughter, was a reminder that love, trust, and connection could still exist, even when betrayal had threatened to destroy everything. I also started to cautiously explore life beyond my former marriage. Casual outings, conversations with friends, small moments of joy. These were not about replacing what I had lost, but about reconnecting with the part of me that thrived when I was free from manipulation and deceit. I realized that happiness is not given. It is rebuilt, moment by moment, choice by choice. Reflecting on the journey, I understood that protecting yourself is not selfish, it is necessary. Strategic planning, emotional intelligence, and the courage to act decisively are tools of empowerment, not cruelty. I had not sought revenge. I had sought survival, dignity, and clarity. In doing so, I had demonstrated that one can face betrayal without losing oneself, and that integrity and resilience always outlast deceit. The final lesson I want to leave for anyone watching or listening is this: your worth is not defined by someone else's choices. Betrayal is painful, but it can reveal the depth of your strength. Plan carefully, act with integrity, and never let anyone undermine your value. Life will test you, but survival and growth are possible. And sometimes the most profound victories are quiet, measured, and deeply personal. I stand here today in my home with my dog by my side and my daughter by my heart, and I am whole, not unscathed, but unbroken. That, I have learned, is a victory worth more than anything else in the world.